Let me do a little sound check. Am I okay? Too loud? A little hot? Good? All right. Well, good morning, everyone. When I was given the task to teach 1 Corinthians in a quarter, you realize it's got 16 chapters and you've got 13 weeks and you have to do a little bit of an introduction, and then out of the blue they decide that we're going to invite an out-of-town speaker on the 30th, which if you haven't seen the announcement, you'll see this morning. And so we will not have classes on the 30th. There's actually a joint class and he'll be teaching us, so it knocks me down to 12 weeks. And so you start going, how do I fit this in? And so I've tried to break it down thematically, meaning looking at the themes that are there. So today, by schedule, we would cover chapters 8, 9, 10, and then the first verse in chapter 11. We're not going to be able to get through that, so I'll just apologize. But in advance, you are responsible for knowing all this information for the final at the end of the class. So even though we'll do that. And what do you think a teacher's favorite thing is?
Questions. A room full of patients. A room full of
A pop quiz.
class participation.
No, it's really a pop quiz. So I'm going to show you in the next couple of slides 3 quotes. One quote, the first quote from chapter 7, and then 2 from 8, 9, and 10. And I'm going to be basically saying, look for what's in common. Now, it may not be immediately, apparent, but there is a commonality there. And then the fourth question would be from your life, and the answer to the fourth question should have something in common with the first 3. So it seems a little bit confusing right now, but let me show you the first one. And these are things that I think we have to thought. And by the way, I've tried to sort of front load the principles that are covered in 8, 9, and 10 and the first verse of 11. So even if we don't get to all of the details of the texts, we will cover some of these things. So here's the first question, and I've quoted 2 brief passages of Scripture, but I've skipped a couple of verses. So you'll notice that I've got 12 and 13 on the board there on the screen, and then verse 16. So just reading that, Paul wrote, "To the rest I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him." And then skipping a couple of verses down to 16. "For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife?" And the question is, why does Paul write verse 16? I mean, if you've got 12 and 13 and they're from the Lord, they're a command. And last week we read a passage from Mark that basically parallels what Paul says here. Why does he write verse 16? This is when you get to talk. Who wants to show off?
Well, you can be an influence on them, so don't give up on them.
Peter also refers to the wife and when her husband without a word, her influences.
So what is the purpose of 16? You're close. You're right there. And when I say it, you go, well, that's what I meant. What's the purpose of 16?
Well, you're supposed to save people. So why not save your spouse?
You're supposed to save people. So this verse is meant to be an encouragement from the Christian, to the Christian, that says, wife, you don't know, you might convert your husband. Husband, you may convert your wife. That's meant to be an encouragement, because life can be rough in a split marriage from a religious standpoint. There can be all sorts of conflicts that don't take place when husband and wife are both Christians. But you mentioned it, and I just want to emphasize it. Why would this be an encouragement? It would be an encouragement if you value saving others. In this case, the saving of your spouse. This verse doesn't work for what it's intended if you don't care about evangelism, if you don't care about saving other people. This verse just becomes sort of a rhetorical question without a point. But Paul wants to encourage you to live through the struggles. You've got a command. So, the command is a command. But this is meant to be an encouragement that if you're with this non-believing spouse, maybe through your living the Christian life, you'll be able to save them. All right. Now some quotes from the chapters we'll cover today. So from 8:13, Paul says, "Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble." What value decision does Paul make? And if you're going to obey this voice, what do you have to think?
You have to think what is better for others and for yourself and not be judgmental.
So you do have to think about what is better for others. But isn't it it's similar but not the same as what we said in chapter 7? What we've got here is a statement here that says, I don't want to do this if my brother stumbles. The result of stumbling in this context is to at least fall, to sin. It could be a stumbling that leads to falling away. That's not clearly described in this verse, but it's a possibility. But Paul is saying here, avoiding causing my brother to stumble. We turn that into an evangelistic statement. I want my brother to be saved so much I won't eat meat. Now, we'll get to this hopefully today, but this is really the important part of this. In the context, we're going to read that eating meat, eating food, and by the way, the word generally food and then specifically meat is used in chapter 8, and so we're not sure if he means a lot of food or just meat. But it is a right to eat meat. But Paul will give up that right if giving up that right helps my brother to be saved. The value there is I value the salvation of my brother more than I value my right to eat food.
And doesn't that relate to other things as well, not just
Yeah.
meat?
Yes, yes.
Does that mean stumble or grumble?
All right, third question. Yeah, no, I make people grumble all the time, but I don't want to make them stumble.
When I first became a Christian, he came to the church and they said, you can't go to movies, you can't do this, you can't do that, and because other people get upset by it. But they're not going to leave the church. So they're just grumbling because they want you to live by their standards. That's a problem.
Yeah. So the example that from the scriptures, not from the thing there, Titus and Timothy and circumcision. One gets circumcised and one doesn't get circumcised. And they both make a point. One is so he can fit in with the crowd, and one is I'm making a stand that we're not following the law of Moses. So that's an example where, same procedure, if you will, but the circumstance is different. And one you make a stand saying I'm not following the law of Moses, and the other one says I don't want people to be offended by listening to a man who's not circumcised, so this person will be circumcised. It's very much the same. So we'll come back to that kind of thing. So listen to Paul. He says, "For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some." What's the value judgment here? What is Paul weighing?
Anybody else?
So it is his accommodation not to sin. Okay, we're not talking about sin. It's not accommodating to sin. But his accommodation to Jew, outside the law, Gentiles, to weak, whatever it is, he looks at this as I can adjust my freedom. He says, I'm free from all, yet I made myself a servant to all. He values salvation in other people. He values evangelism. He values saving others much more than he values these circumstances. Again, we're not talking about sins. We're just talking about being accommodating to fit in. The value judgment is he will adjust his life to fit in so that others can be saved. It's very much the same as what we've talked about in the other two passages. It is to say, I value the salvation of others so much, I'll adjust my life to fit in. I won't eat meat. And I'll hope that in a mixed marriage that the non-Christian might be saved. So what am I going to ask next? This is the part that comes up for you. What do these verses have in common? We've kind of touched about. But now the fourth question, the one from your life. What do you do, give up, or endure to save one or more souls? See, if we don't value evangelism, if we don't value reaching the lost, we won't adjust. We won't give up our freedoms. We won't do what it takes to save others.
Amen.
And this is the heart of these three chapters plus one verse. 8, 9, and 10 are all about this. It is the story of the Corinthian church being proud of their rights and wanting to exercise their rights and not taking a viewpoint to say, how will my exercising of my rights affect other people? And we're going to see that it's often negative. And Paul raises these value questions, but they only work when you value lost souls. And if you don't, all of this just sort of falls apart. Yes?
Could we come up with an example like in our lives? Because we don't have the circumcision negation. I mean, what would compare? What would we give up? It would be compromising what we believe.
I think the examples that were brought up about, if you were in a culture that really didn't think going to movies in a movie theater was a good thing, and you wanted to reach them, you don't go in and say, I'm going to the movies this Friday night because it's my right. You just sort of accommodate that. It's not that it's really a sin. It's the accommodation. I don't want to upset people. Now, in the passage in chapter 8, which deals with meat eating to brothers, we'll get to that. I hope that we get to this. What happens is that the weaker brother, which is a term we're going to see, is encouraged to do this eating too. And because of his background, he stumbles. So Paul is going to say, hey, idols are nothing. He's going to say that. But he's going to say that there are people who their background is such that they'll see you eating meats, probably even in a temple, and that's a little bit of a judgment call, but that's where I think he goes. They've been sacrificed to idols, but you, Paul, someone in Corinth, know that idols are nothing, so who cares if it's been sacrificed to nothing? But Paul says, don't look at it that way. What Paul says is, you need to look at it in the way it will impact the other person. And if that other person sees you doing something that they actually, as a matter of conscience, really question, and by seeing you do that, they're encouraged to do that too, but it crosses that line where they do something they don't really feel is right, you cause them to stumble.
Isn't this a cultural thing?
So say it again.
It's a cultural thing. Cultures change.
Well, cultures change. These are religious beliefs. So the specifics of eating meats are religious,
But it is not a problem for us today.
Yeah, right. We're not in that thing today, but we could be in a position where we know something is okay, but the people around us haven't done that, and we're not going to press that point. We're not going to try to make it an example. Proving you're right has to be done very, very carefully. It goes back to that circumcision question, and one person gets circumcised to accommodate, and one person doesn't. That's it. Yes?
My grandmother, she lived with us part of the time, living with my other aunt and uncle around, just down the street part of the time. She absolutely we got out spot cards, she called them. She's had her eyes. We could get out roll call we wanted to. But we could not have spot cards in front of her. When she would come to stay, we had to hide her spot cards. Good regular cards.
So we're going to get to this. I want to be precise about this. There may be a time when you need to prove that something's okay and you do it. But if you were putting your mother in a position of feeling obligated, she needed to play with you, even though she really didn't think it was right, and yet you're bringing that in there and sort of saying, oh, come on, it's okay, and she's going, I'm not really sure it's okay. And she does it, she crosses that line. And that's what this is about. This is about being in a circumstance where somebody sees you exercising a right, but they're not at the same place conscientiously, and they're encouraged to do it. That's a key part of this particular passage. So it is that there. So let's read these verses, and I think you'll see some of these things come up. Now concerning, so this is Paul's introduction of some idea that seems to be in the letter the Corinthians sent to him. So they wrote a letter. We don't know what the letter was. We don't have a copy of it. But they brought up this topic of food offered to idols. He says, now concerning food offered to idols, we know that, quote, all of us possess knowledge. That may have been in their letter. We're not sure, but that's what ESV thinks. That's why it's in quotes. It's a statement made by some in the church at Corinth. Paul responds, this knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. What's the difference between being puffed up and built up? Puffed up is just being full of hot air. There's no substance to it. But built up is to be strengthened. And that's what Paul sort of takes this and kind of slaps down whatever they're saying. Verse 2. If anyone imagines that he knows something, he does not yet know as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, he is known by God. Paul's going to make this play, verse 3, that knowledge is not the key to your relationship to God, it's love. But we'll talk about that as it goes on. Verse 4, therefore, as to the eating of food offered to idols, we know that an idol has no real existence. Okay? Idols are just hunks of wood or metal or rock or whatever you got. There's nothing there. And there is no God but one. Those seem to be things that the Corinthians said. For although there are many so-called gods in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things and for whom we exist, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom we are all things, through whom we exist. Now, for time's sake, Paul is going to allow that there really are demons, but the idols are really just nothing. But we'll talk about that later if we have time. Verse 7, however, here's where you get into it. However, not all possess this knowledge, but some, through former associations with idols, eat food as really offered to an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled. Food will not commend us to God. We are no worse off if we do not eat, and no better off if we do. But take care that this right of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. For if anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, will he not be encouraged? That is, the weak one will be encouraged. Oh, I saw Daryl in the temple eating meats. Man, I remember when I was there every day sacrificing to idols. I guess it's something that it's okay to do because Daryl's doing it, but I don't really feel sure that it's right. And so I go ahead and do it. Not really sure that it's the right thing to do it, but I do it because I admire Daryl. So, verse 10, for if anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, will he not be encouraged if his conscience is weak to eat food offered to idols? Your example may very well be followed by someone not as knowledgeable, not as mature as you are. And they might do what you do, not having that knowledge, not having the real confidence about what's right and wrong, and they do something they really question is right or wrong. So, verse 11, and so by your knowledge, this weak person is destroyed. I want to emphasize the word destroyed there. It actually does not mean like hurt or bruised. It's destroyed. It's a word that in other contexts refers to eternal damnation. It is that a person could do this, a weak person could do this, and it could ruin his spiritual life. He may never recover. It's not that God would not forgive him, but it leads downward. So it says, verse 11, and so by your knowledge the weak person is destroyed. The brother for whom Christ died. Why does he say that? Lest you don't value weaker brothers. Jesus died for them. He died for you, but he also died for them. Don't destroy them. Verse 12, thus, sinning against your brothers and wounding their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ. Talk about big bats to hit people over the head. Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat lest I make my brother stumble. So whatever rights you have, in whatever century you live in, you don't just say, I'm going to do that because it's my right. You look at how it affects someone who's weaker, who doesn't have the same level of knowledge. And if they're going to follow you in doing something that they doubt is right, but they see you doing it, you've just sinned against your brother. You've just sinned against Christ. It's pretty strong. So let's, for purposes of understanding, what are the circumstances? Okay, the circumstances here are, some know that an idol is nothing, verse 4. Others, through former association with idols, eat food as really offered to an idol. They really think this is something, that there's an idol, there's a reality behind the idol. And their conscience being weak is defiled. When a weak, conscious person sees a brother who has knowledge that an idol is nothing, eating in an idol's temple, eating food sacrificed to an idol, he is encouraged to do the same, to eat food sacrificed to an idol, and his conscience is defiled. So that's the circumstance. What's the principle? What's the sin? The knowledge and freedom to eat destroys the brother with a weak conscience, a brother for whom Christ died. Wounding a weak conscience is a sin against Christ. That's the sin. It's a step away. It's, the sin for this one who has all this knowledge is not the eating of the food sacrificed to an idol. That's not what Paul is saying is the sin. The sin is this stuff. He's done it without consideration of the weaker brother and what that might do to him. So the solution to the problem is, as Paul said, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat lest I make my brother stumble. So the idea is taken off of rights and it's put on effects on other people. And that becomes the issue. So you can change these things to whatever kind of thing fits the pattern. Today, if you're exercising of your right, encourages a weaker brother to do something they don't really feel is right and their conscience is wounded, you've done this.
But don't you also have a responsibility to teach this younger brother?
You do. In the circumstance, remember, he sees you doing it and he does it too. It doesn't address, well, you should talk to them about it. In reality, you shouldn't go in and eat to that. If you're aware that this is an issue, you should go teach them before you go. So yes, you always need to teach people to build up their knowledge. But this seems to be a circumstance in a letter. The Corinthian church wrote this problem statement, if you will, to Paul. And, hey, we know that an idol is nothing, and we want to go in and eat these things, and we've seen people watch us do it, and we don't want to feel guilty because we're just exercising our right. And Paul says, no, you don't exercise your rights. You consider its effect on others. And there is a time and a place to teach them. But this seems to be a circumstance where Paul has received a letter that deals with this kind of thing. So rights can become stumbling blocks when we don't understand, don't appreciate their effects on other people. And this example is the effect on people who don't have as much knowledge, some might say maturity, as you do.
But he's talking about a brother in the Lord.
Yes. Yep.
They combine two things, converted people and people become a member of the Lord's church, becoming a Christian. We got to remember in our society, we have a lot of Hindus and Muslims in our society. You treat them with respect. Like I've had a customer. I had to wait on her and her husband finished praying to their idol, a Hindu idol. I had to wait on them. And because I stopped and waited on them, I didn't interrupt them, they were so grateful for that. I mean, not because I was a better person, I knew this, to be respectful. A Muslim who was a very good customer, was going through Ramadan. And he knew I was a Christian. He invited me into his office. We talked about the Lord's Supper and Ramadan and fasting. Treat people with respect, they'll talk to you about the Lord. And both of them were interested in Christ those two times, the Hindu and the Muslim. That's just what this is about, treating people with respect in their feelings and their thoughts.
And I'll take this, it goes to the step that you described, but you didn't use this term. You can accommodate them. You can accommodate them and then look for the right opportunity. You will want to teach them. You will want to talk with them. But again, it's the circumstance here in this letter. They seem to want to assert their rights, no matter what the impact is. And that's the problem.
Think about this, the Hindu, I would never would take them to a hamburger joint, for example, and I would not take the Muslim and go have
pulled pork.
I would not do that, because I don't know what the reaction would be to that.
Yeah. So if you want to chase that one, the pulled pork thing, if it could be to the point that if you're eating in a lunchroom together and you got your pulled pork sandwich, that you don't pull it out. Because if you sit there in the lunchroom and they're sitting there at the table with you and you're going, oh, this is so good. You just wouldn't believe the smoke, the juiciness, the barbecue sauce. This is really, you're missing out if you don't eat this stuff. That's just an encouragement to do something they're not ready to do. And you don't go there. You just need to accommodate the what's there. All right, we got about 11 minutes. I think I've covered this a lot, but there's a couple of verses that I wanted to bring up here. So the Corinthians had succumbed to interpreting their faith in a manner amenable to the society in which they lived, meaning the church at Corinth and the Corinthian emphasis, knowledge, wisdom, rhetoric, all of these things, the Corinthians allowed that to influence their Christian life. Their society greatly valued knowledge and wisdom as spiritual virtues, and the miraculous gifts felt well into this cultural milieu. So the Corinthians get these spiritual gifts. They're meant to build up the church, but they're now looking at them as sources of pride. Look at me. I've got knowledge. You don't. The underlying theological problem has to do with losing sight of God's grace in Christ, the danger of finding things related to one's spiritual life in which to take pride is one all Christians face. So in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 6, when you look at this, Paul says that this is one of the reasons for not appointing a recent convert to the office of an elder. That verse says, he must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Meaning, the blessing of being chosen as a leader, an elder in this church, if you're not mature enough to handle that correctly, you can become puffed up about it. So Paul says, don't appoint men to be elders who are recent converts, or they will do that. Jeremiah addressed leadership in Jeremiah chapter 9, verses 23 and 24. I'll read that to you. He says, let not the wise man boast in his wisdom. Let not the mighty man boast in his might. Let not the rich man boast in his riches, but let him who boasts in this, that he may understand and knows me, that I am the Lord who practices steadfast love, justice, and righteousness in the earth. For in these things I delight, declares the Lord. God may give us great blessings in this life, but remember, God gave you those blessings. They are not sources of human pride. They are not to be things that you boast of. It is, as was the problem in Corinth, that temptation, the desire to show off because you're proud, rather than just being thankful to God for what you've been given and giving him the glory. We need to encourage assurance. Many Christians wonder or struggle with whether their faith is secure. A poor understanding or weak self-awareness regarding our position in God's people can easily be exploited by those who have become puffed up and boastful of their own supposed community standing. Those who think they are something need to realize that they can end up leading others to sin when they no longer see love for God and love for neighbors as the true markers of community standing. By that I mean as in the church, fitting in God's will in the church. Then they become arrogant toward others. the ability of Christians to give up what they see as their rights and privileges, even things they enjoy, for the sake of a Christian brother or sister, is ultimately the test of love. And that's what we need to follow here. Let me just survey 9. I put the outline here because I knew I was going to run out of time, and we are running out of time. Paul uses himself as an example of giving up his rights. And the people who are benefiting from it are the Corinthians, but they may not know it and may not appreciate it. So Paul says he's free and he's an apostle, and as an apostle, he has the right to support. Other apostles, they get support. Even soldiers are allowed for support. The Mosaic Law grants him the right to support. But as one who is free, he, Paul, has relinquished the right to support. He worked for his living, tent making. He got gifts from other people, perhaps, other places. But he did not take from the church at Corinth. Not because it wasn't his right, but he gave up his right so he would not put a stumbling block in the way of the gospel. It's an important thing. He evidently judged that the church at Corinth might look at him receiving support from them, I don't know, resent it, have problems with it, not be willing to follow him. Oh, he's just here because we're paying him. No, Paul says, hey, I give up that right. I have not chosen to exercise it, but all these reasons I could, but I don't. Why? Because I'll give up anything in order to avoid a stumbling block. And that goes sort of where we were at the beginning. The value choice is just how valuable to you is the salvation of others. And weigh what you have against salvation of others. So, support from preachers. We need to understand that Paul makes a series of arguments that preachers have a right. But in reality, where we want to go with this, and this actually comes out in some of those Old Testament passages in chapter 9, the idea that God gives blessings, gifts, if you will, to the church. Some have miraculous gifts like knowledge. Others are skills like being a preacher or a teacher. And as church members, we need to remember that they are gifts from God and that we give freely, that they don't have to worry about supporting themselves. So when Christians understand that their leadership in the church, as well as many other things, are gifts from God, then there can be joy in giving and supporting that enable these leaders to live and serve without worry for provision. So think of them as gifts. Here Paul is basically saying that, well, let me just pick one from the middle because we're about to run out of time. Verse 23, right, sort of in the middle. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. Do you not know that in a race all runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as beating one in the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. So there's all sorts of things that Paul knows he needs to bring under control in order to be a successful, in the eyes of God, person who carries out God's will, a preacher in his sense. All right, we are at 14 minutes. Let me just stop here for a minute. Any comments, questions, last observations? Yes, Jerry?
Just quickly, all of this is really good, but do we as Christians today do it with regard to politics?
And Jerry will take next Sunday's class and explain it all for us. All right. Thank you very, very much. You are dismissed.